Hey everyone, this is James from TDB bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today is going to be a straight talking Inbetweenisode, not going to be drinking any tea here. One of Denny and my goals this year is to get to 10,000 subscribers, so if you haven't already, please do subscribe for this year. So this topic today, we are going to be talking all about Yiwu tea, as well as just kind of the 6 famous tea mountains areas, which is an area that's kind of around Yiwu. When we're talking about regions and things like that, I think especially when it comes to people just starting out, there's a lot of regions you don't need to pay too close of attention to. It's sort of like you can take a greater area and then get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's kind of what's happened over the course of pu'erh in the last 20 years, is there's been a lot of focus on terroir. And as you get kind of like micro-focused, I think it's not as important for someone that's just starting out. So for instance, you could go into like Yiwu area, which is a fairly large area, and then you get smaller to like Wangong or something like that, and then you get to, I don't know, someone's garden in Wangong, or you get to like, oh, this very specific tree is very, very special. So I think in general, it's better to focus on kind of like the bigger picture, the bigger ones. That being said, I think Yiwu is one of those that you're going to see mentioned so prominently, and I do think it's one worth learning a fair bit about. So what is Yiwu? Well, it is both a township, a county, and a mountain. It is one of the 6 famous tea mountains. So these are mountains that are located on the eastern part of Xishuangbanna. 5 of the 6 are in Mengla County. The 6th of it is just right outside there, Yola, that is that one. And so these mountains really have a long history of growing tea. That history goes back to the Haoji era, which is an era before World War II, where there were teas grown there. So things like Songpin Hao, Tongqing Hao, Fuyun Chang. So these different productions were made back then. Odds are you haven't tried them. I haven't tried them either. They're not super relevant, but in terms of just like kind of modern day pu'erh and the context there. But it is kind of worth noting that this is an area that does have a very, very long history of growing tea. And so these operations back then, and a lot of this is outlined in the great book, pu'erh, Ancient Garabands and Urban Chic by Zhang Jinghong. I do highly recommend that book. They talk about how these operations were smaller operations. They weren't like necessarily big, mechanized factory operations like you would see in the West after World War II. These are kind of like home, smaller businesses, more handmade productions. And so when Yunnan started to open back up for people to visit and stuff like that, a bunch of Taiwanese came over in the mid-1990s. I think it is 1994, something like that. It was the key year. And so these guys basically came over from Taiwan and were like, okay, let's see what pu'erh you've been making. And they found that there wasn't all that much pu'erh being made in kind of that historical tradition pre-World War II. And so what ended up happening is they started kind of kick-started it to restart operations and kind of going back to those old traditions. And so one very famous tea you'll encounter from this era, the mid-90s, is the Zhenchen Yahao. And you're going to run into a lot of conflicting information about what years they made it and who made it and which years. Honestly, not that important. Sometimes this tea is translated into truly simply elegant. You can Google it. You can find a couple people talking about it. I have also not tried this tea at this point. This is one of those teas that is certainly a high collectible, very rare. I have heard good things about how it is. I've also heard, more mixed reviews about how it is too. But it's a very early tea. And so basically Yiwu would kind of become to known just with like the heavy Taiwanese association as kind of restarting with these more boutique handmade teas, smaller runs than, for instance, the teas of Western Xishuangbanna, so like Dai, Manghai Tea Factory teas, which are more kind of like mass production, mechanized, to put it kind of in more broad, crude terms. And so, you're going to run into a lot of Yiwu teas that are smaller runs and whatnot. So Yiwu tea, part of those 6 famous tea mountains. Let's take a step back real fast. So the other 5 are also, more or less kind of associated with the greater Yiwu area. So a lot of what I was saying earlier about the areas and growing tea is the same for these. So places like Manjuan, Gedang, Ibang, Yola. So they all have a little difference to their terroir, but I think if you were to look at sort of the greater area, you could associate them together. If we're talking about kind of like these small handmade, small runs, things like that, I think these areas are also would also kind of fall into that bucket as well. Yeah, and the further you get away from kind of like the eastern part of Mangla County, the more different it does become. So like Yola is the sixth famous tea mountain that is outside of Mangla County, and that you're starting to get into a somewhat different profile there. And that's a mountain that's not always classified as kind of like the greater Yiwu area. A couple small nuances to this, Ibang and Gedang, and elsewhere, sometimes you will run into the smaller leaf varietal, and so they are known for that as well, which kind of does lend to a somewhat different character there. Another area that you will run into that's part of kind of like this greater Yiwu area is Mansa and Guafengjai. These are known for kind of a darker, heavier taste compared to it, and that runs really close to the border with Laos. And so, of course, you're going to get a lot of border tea. A lot of it perhaps is masqueraded as Yunnan tea and sold as pu'erh. I think that's a pretty sure thing at this point, just because the market for Laotian pu'erh style tea is much, much lower than something like Guafengjai, which is just across the border from where it is, or just Yiwu tea in general. And so, yeah, one thing that is also true is that these boutiques that have been making the tea have often produced it in a somewhat softer style than you're going to encounter elsewhere in Yunnan, specifically from like some of the bigger factories. So Yiwu tea, the terroir, as well as kind of this processing style, lends itself to kind of like this a little bit softer. It's a little bit less punchy, but it can certainly have some strength, and it will have this really nice, more complex aftertaste that you'll run into. So a very different character, and I do think it's worth seeking out and trying Yiwu tea. It's definitely one of the regions that you would check out. For instance, when I first got started with pu'erh, I decided I was going to tackle it by region. Yiwu was actually the first region I tackled. I forget who I was inspired by, but just by reading a lot of the different pu'erh blogs. And so I sampled something like 20 or 25 Yiwus, mostly got from Yunnan Sourcing and White Tea back in, I think, 2014, something around that range. And I found I really liked the tea and the area, and I got a great feel for it. So for me, at least, I immediately gravitated towards this sorts of tea. So yeah, I would definitely recommend people. I don't think you need to try 20 or 25 of them, but I do think it's an area that's definitely worth checking out. And within Yiwu, there's quite a range too. You can actually find factory Yiwus. You can also find a boutique like Dragon Tea House, which is sold by Teas We Like. That focuses a lot more on kind of what they see as a more traditional style, and the tea presents itself very differently. And so that kind of helps to call into question how much of this is the actual terroir versus the processing that some of these producers are doing. Perhaps the producers are doing the softer processing rather than kind of the more heavy rolling and whatnot to smooth out the taste and hunging the tea, which is kind of oxidizing it to make a more immediately appealing brew, and perhaps that won't age as well. So there's a lot of different conflicting reports about things like that. Nonetheless, I do think that Yiwu tea is definitely worth checking out, sampling, try out the younger versions. The younger versions are easy to find, as well as some of the older ones, the Taiwanese boutiques. It is very interesting. I do like a lot of those teas. Generally speaking, unlike, for instance, a Dai Tea Factory, a bigger run where you're going to have a couple characteristic recipes that they're making throughout time. So something like try the 2006 or 7542, whatever, or the 8582. You're not going to quite have an equivalent when it comes to Yiwu tea, and part of that is just the nature of these smaller runs and the fact that it's not like there's one big producer that is kind of like the gold star of Yiwu tea, just because of the nature of how it is. But check out just teas kind of marketed as Yiwu, marketed under those other famous tea mountains as well. Manjuan, Yola, those are probably the ones that you're going to run into. Ibang as well, fairly often as far as marketing terms. And just know to kind of associate these teas together as been like, hey, these are not the exact same areas, but they do come from kind of the same county. Okay, so I think that just about wraps up this Inbetweenisode, a little bit more open-ended. So hope everyone enjoyed it. Let me know how you liked it, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.